The Naval Institute's an open, independent, nonpartisan forum that has championed the exchange of ideas for 150 years this year. It's been 50 years since we welcomed home the prisoners of war from the war in Vietnam. And this morning's panel is the lessons of heroism, the Vietnam POW experience. And we welcome Commander Porter Halyburton, USN retired, Taylor Baldwin Keeland, and Commander Ward Carroll, U.S. Navy retired. Porter survived captivity as a prisoner of war for 7 years, 3 months, and 28 days. In the first part, for the better part of a year, he was listed as killed in action. Porter shares the valuable lessons that he took away from his time in the Hanoi Hilton and 8 other POW camps, and tells that story in his recent book, Reflections on Captivity. His many awards include the Silver Star, the Bronze Star, 3 awards of the Bronze Star, Legion of Merit, 3 Purple Hearts, and 7 Air Medals. He currently resides with his wife, Marty, in Greensboro, North Carolina. They have 3 grown children. And I'd like to ask Marty to stand and be recognized for her amazing strength. Taylor Keeland has written, co-authored, co-written, or edited 21 books, including 3 books about the experiences of the prisoners of war in Vietnam. These include Unwavering, The Wives Who Fought to Ensure No Man is Left Behind, Lessons from the Hanoi Hilton, 6 Characteristics of High-Performance Teams, and Open Doors, Vietnam POWs 30 years later. A former naval officer, the 3rd generation in her family to serve in the Navy, Taylor was raised in Coronado, California, and Virginia, and she grew up with many of the POWs' families and their families and MIA families. Taylor lives with her husband and her daughter in Old Town Alexandria. And I think her daughter's here today. We'll say hi. Hello. Panel moderator Ward Carroll flew an F-14 Tomcat for 15 years after graduating from the U.S. Naval Academy. He was the Naval Institute Author of the Year in 2001 for his novel, Punk's War. He's also the author of Punk's Wing and Punk's Fight. Ward's a friend of the Institute. He's an alum of our staff, and he's a host of a popular Ward Carroll YouTube channel. The conversation today is going to last about 60 minutes, and we're going to open the forum to questions. And for those who are live, please use the chat feature. And for those who are in the audience, we have mics deployed down here at the foot of the 2 main aisles. And our request is this: please tell us who you are, and please ask a question. Really appreciate that. And we'll try to address as many questions as possible. Please go to stun on your phone. And after the panel discussion, each of the panelists and our moderator will be available for a short book signing out in our atrium to sign their latest books. If you're interested, we'll have that available for you. And so now I turn it over to Ward Carroll and our great panel. Over to you, Ward.
Thank you, Pete. So it's great to be back home, in essence. As Pete mentioned, I was on the staff for 5 years until very recently, and watched when this room was built basically during COVID. So it's great to be back here and dealing with this very important topic. So when Adam and Robin of the press asked me to moderate this panel, I said yes right away, because when I was a mid here, a lot of my instructors and battalion officers and the superintendent were POWs. I'm talking about names like Lawrence, McGrath, Galante, and the others, particularly Admiral Stockdale, would be present often. So they were truly mentors of mine. Commander McGrath, later Captain McGrath, was my leadership instructor when I was a second class. But what I have realized from reading Porter's book, and this is a lesson that Eric Mills has taught me, there's always history to be told. And this book is incredible for its nuanced insights as well as his achingly powerful poetry. He's truly a poet, and we'll ask him to read some of it during the course of his remarks. But let me start with a little Naval Institute Press trivia. What was the first novel ever published by the Naval Institute Press? And members of the staff are not allowed to answer these questions, especially the CEO. Okay, what was the third novel ever published? Dog Company 6 by General Simmons, who's passed away, great guy. What was the fourth novel ever published?
Punk's War.
Punk's War, yes, great. Okay, so the second novel ever published was Flight of the Intruder by my deer hunting mentor, Stephen Kuntz. I was honored to write the foreword for the 20th anniversary edition that the Naval Institute Press published in 2006. But you may know, if you haven't read the book, I'm not talking about watching the movie, I'm talking about read the book. You'll see that one of the themes, maybe the main theme, is aviators who are dissatisfied with putting their life at risk for missions that don't matter. And so in that book, they create one that's going to matter. So this theme very much resonates with Porter. So Porter, let's talk about the fateful day. And you're in VF-84, the Jolly Rogers. You're in F-4 RIO aboard the USS Independence.
Right.
So take it away.
Well, this was to be my 76th mission. I had flown 75 before, and as a prelude to what you were talking about, Ward, I think by this time many of us were becoming a little disillusioned with what we were doing, which was essentially our overall mission was to stop the flow of supplies coming from North Vietnam. China, Russia, all the other communist countries were bringing it there, and we were trying to cut the supply lines that goes down into the Ho Chi Minh Trail and into South Vietnam. And that was largely what our overall mission was. We did lots of other things. But those 75 missions were, by the time that we got this assignment, was, I thought, pretty trivial. Bombing little bridges that were rebuilt in a couple of days, so they made a ford or something. We were looking for trucks that we never saw. And I will say I didn't understand why we never saw any trucks, but once we got familiar with things, I did understand. The trucks all had a framework on the top, and they put fresh cut branches and greenery and everything in the structure that stuck out several feet beyond the truck's boundaries. And when they heard a siren or got a warning, they just pulled over to the side of the road and became a grove of trees. Very clever folks, and we just never figured that out. And so I think we were kind of apprehensive about risking our lives again for trivial targets, while the important targets were all in the pocket of Johnson and McNamara. So this target was the bridge, rail and road bridge at Tai Nguyen, which is an industrial city about 40 miles north of Hanoi. It links China to Hanoi. So it was a major target. We had SINCPAC was at our briefing, and which indicated this was a big one. So we were all pretty excited. Two F-4 squadrons had 4 planes each. We were assigned flak suppression, dueling with the anti-aircraft guns, while the A6s and A7s, A4, excuse me, bombed this bridge. And so we were afraid of SAM-2s, which didn't operate below 3,000 feet, and so we were below 3,000 feet, put us right in the envelope of anti-aircraft fire. And I was with Stan Olmsted, who I thought was the best pilot in the squadron, and I'd flown with him many times, had great confidence in him. But he did not see the flak coming in from the starboard side, and all of a sudden we were hit in the front cockpit and papers flying all around. I could see the holes in the canopy in the front, and his Stan's head lolled over without a helmet on. I tried to key the microphone and realized my oxygen mask had been blown off, and so I had no radio contact. The plane was still going straight and level, but headed right for a mountain, and I had very few seconds to make a decision, and I reached up for the handle to punch out, and there was my crumpled up knee board was on top of the thing. So I realized that we had been hit pretty hard, and so I used the alternate handle. I punched out and had a few swings in the chute and landed and got rid of my gear and decided I needed to get on the other side of this hill because I knew the carrier had sent a destroyer up with a rescue helicopter. I didn't know whether they'd ever get in there or not, but I wanted to be on the other side of the gunfire that was coming from this village, and so I ran towards this. There wasn't much cover there, but I picked out the biggest bunch of bushes and ran towards it, and a great big snake decided he wanted to go in that bush, and so I let him have that one, and I went for lesser cover and was captured in about 20 minutes. The villagers came up and everything, and I will say I was already captured when the flight came back over the same track out. Of course, 2 more airplanes got shot down as a result. And I, just as a side remark, I know that there was a lesson there that should have been learned about going in and coming out on the same track, or multiple missions doing the same thing. And this was expensive when the B-52s were bombing in 72 and 73, because all the B-52s, my understanding, that were shot down were because of this. And after they quit doing that, they didn't shoot down another B-52. So I'm sorry they didn't learn a lesson from,
Well, it took us many decades. That's sort of the lesson one at Strike U that was created after the POW Valley raid. But how fast was the airplane going when you ejected?
We were pretty slow, maybe 360, because the A4s, were loaded down with lots of bombs, and that was about as fast as they could go.
So did you sustain any injuries during the ejection or when you hit the ground?
Oh, lots of cuts and bruises and things, but nothing, no broken bones or anything. So I was very lucky in that regard.
So your trip to Hanoi after you were captured, what was that like?
Well, it was in a Jeep. They sent militia, or I'm not sure if they were regular Army guys. It took a couple of days to get there, even though it was only 40 miles, but the roads were so horrific that it was really, really slow going. And we stopped for an interrogation session at a village. Then we spent the night at another Army camp, and then finally got to the Hanoi Hilton. Yeah.
So your first interrogation experience, what was that like? What happened?
Well, it was in this village that had one brick building, and I'm sure it was used for school administration. Everything important, happened there, and so I was sitting on a bench, and there was a table, and there were several Vietnamese on the other side, and one of them clearly was in charge. He was not in uniform, and he had a phrase book, and none of them spoke English, and so he would write out questions and shove the paper over with a pencil for me to answer these questions, like what kind of airplane, and the standard stuff, and I would just push the paper back, and And after a while, there was a guard at the door to this building that had an AK-47, and after I'd pushed the questions back about 3 times, he comes and puts a barrel of the AK-47 against my head, and I thought, well, this is it. But then I noticed there were Vietnamese on the other side that didn't get out of the way. And so I figured, well, maybe he's probably not going to shoot me right now. So this went on again. And finally, this guy got really upset. He came running over, put the barrel up against my head, and chambered around. And then all the Vietnamese on the other side got out of the way. And I said, okay. I just closed my eyes and said, okay, this is it. And when I opened my eyes again, they had gotten him out and taken away his AK-47, and they gave up after that. And so we got back in the Jeep. Oh, they put me on display as kind of a trophy. I think very little bombing up in this area. And actually the village where I was kept, they were just curious. They were not hostile. They treated me well and so on. I later tried to go back and find that village and sort of thank them, but it wasn't there.
So you were a SEER School grad, of course?
Yes.
And so the Code of Conduct was something you were familiar with?
Absolutely.
So did you find right away limits to strict compliance with the Code of Conduct?
Well, I tried my best to obey the letter and to believe what we had been told, name, rank, service number, date of birth, be willing to die before giving anything else. And of course we found out, that wasn't going to work. It wasn't reasonable. And our leadership, Stockdale, Denton, Reiser, and others, certainly figured that out, that the Code of Conduct was a guide. It was not an absolute admonition. And so it takes leadership to interpret the Code of Conduct in view of the circumstances. And so that's what we learned. That's what their guidance was as we went along. But at the very beginning, I was not going to give them anything else. And so I wish we'd figured that out. It would have saved a lot of misery.
I mean, somewhere between strict compliance and dereliction of duty lives what we're talking about here.
Exactly.
It's not an excuse to just be a coward, if not non-compliance. So you get to Hanoi, your first roommate was in a bad way, and that was an interesting circumstance, and you were hesitant at first when you were informed that was going to be your roommate. So talk to us about your relationship and what happened with Captain Cherry.
Well, when I refused to answer questions, I got a lot of beatings, a lot of threats, a lot of leg irons and things like that, but nothing that, I couldn't withstand, and I wasn't going to give them anything. And finally, after a period of time, they said, if you continue to refuse to talk to us, we'll move you to a worse place. Well, hell, I was in the Hanoi Hilton in the little cell block that we called Heartbreak Hotel, which was aptly, we named it that. And it was just 2 concrete slabs with built-in leg irons, filth everywhere. And I couldn't imagine a worse place. But they said, you'll move to a worse place. But if you talk to us, we'll move you to a better place. You'll be with your friends, better food, right home, and all of this. And so I chose the worst place. And this happened 3 more times, and each place was worse in its own way. Not the same way, but worse. But I did wind up in what I thought was the worst place they had, which was a storage shed that had been used to store coal, and it was filthy. It was I was sick by this time. I was beginning to despair because I had been in isolation, which is different than solitary confinement. Matter of fact, I've had fellow friends of mine who've been through both and say, if I had to choose between torture and isolation, I'd take the torture. And so isolation does crazy things to your mind. and you have no contact with anybody else. And so I was in isolation for 2 of these places, and I didn't know how I was going to survive that place, much less a worse one. And so when they presented me with this choice again, better place, worse place, it was the hardest decision of my life, and I could not see any good outcome from either choice that I made. And so I wasn't going to give in. And so I said no, and that night they moved me up to another cell block, opened the door to this cell, and shoved me inside and said, "You must care for Cherry." And this was a black man, a black Air Force officer. And they slammed the door, and here I was. And so this is the first human I'd seen in quite a while. And so I was personally delighted to see him. Mm-hmm. And I think the Vietnamese had relied on their stereotypical view of American race relations and so on, and prejudice and all of that. And they thought that putting a young Southern white boy in with a black, particularly Air Force one, would be the worst thing that they could do. And in fact, it was absolutely the best thing they could have done. You know, they misjudged that by a long shot. And he was very, very badly injured. He was a 105 pilot. He had blown the canopy on when he got hit with anti-aircraft fire, and cockpit full of smoke, and he couldn't see anything, and so he blew the canopy, and unfortunately his arm went out into the slipstream at about 500 knots, and it nearly ripped it off his body. Yeah. And so he was in pretty bad shape, and I did have to care for him, which this event, being with Fred Cherry, was the event that really changed my whole attitude about captivity and what we had to do to get through this. And first of all, up until that time, I had been solely concerned with just 2 or 3 things. One was to stay as healthy as I could, to survive and get home. And that was it. Do my duty, survive, get home. And when I was given this job to take care of Fred, it gave me something important to do, a meaning in my life other than just survival. And so it was a great privilege for me to be the one that took care of him. Anybody there would have done the same thing, but I had the privilege of doing that. And so that changed my whole attitude about captivity and what we had to do. We had to take care of each other. We had to make sure that nobody was in isolation, that nobody was left outside the communications network. So that was a seminal event.
So you go in great detail about that care. It's amazing, and I entreat the viewers to read the book and discover those details. But there's also a pathos, because then you guys are separated after all of you nursing him back to health in a very Spartan-based way. And you didn't see him again for 5 years. Mm-hmm. So again, that the audience, the unlearned, have a conception of the passage of time here. Mm-hmm. So there were various eras. You know, there was that phase, and then there was the bad years and Ho Chi Minh living and dying, and you were moved around. One of the things that strikes me is the resilience of the American sense of humor and pop culture savvy is the names you had for all the different camps. They're all pretty cool. Yeah. You know, like you said, Heartbreak, Hotel Alcatraz, the Zoo, those kinds of things. But I'd like to bring Taylor in at this point, because her book is brilliant as well, originally published back in '07 when she and I first met. And I'll also mention, to pony on what Pete was saying about Taylor's bio, she comes into this organically, in that you lived at Coronado, you're a 7-year-old girl, and you watched the homecoming of the POWs. And then you worked on the McCain campaign, and you met a lot of the POWs. So this really is not just something you did for whatever transactional value being a historian or a reference book author has, this is a labor of love for you. So in this lives some sort of 30,000-foot tenets and precepts that you've had some takeaway of this amazing cohort of Vietnam-era POWs. One of them is, because Porter's already talked about isolation, torture, passage of time. I think it's an amazing statement to say I'd rather be tortured than in isolation.
Yeah.
That's an amazing statement. But in this era, post 9/11 conflicts, everybody knows what PTSD is. That's in the public lexicon now as a function of those wars. The PTSD rate in these guys is really low. Talk to us about the number and why that is.
Yeah, so the Mitchell Center for POW Studies in Pensacola, Florida, has been conducting exhaustive research on these men because they recognized early on that they were and still are the longest held group of POWs in our nation's history. So they have been studying their physical and mental health over the last 50 years, and they cite the lifetime average rate of PTSD among this cohort of 591 men is 4%. Now, for those of you who know about the average rate of PTSD of other Vietnam veterans of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, that is a freakishly low number. Not only that, but among these 591 men, you have a presidential candidate, John McCain. You have a vice presidential candidate, Jim Stockdale. You have senators, congressmen, governors, doctors, lawyers, admirals, generals, authors, ministers. I could go on and on and on. And all of those achievements took place after they returned from Vietnam. So I affectionately call these men, unicorns among combat veterans. And this is from a tiny, tiny group. So the question is, why? There were some natural inoculating factors. These men were older. Their average age was 34. You think about the average age of a combat soldier or sailor, 18, 19, 20. With age comes maturity, better life perspective. And as you know, the Vietnam POWs were overwhelmingly aviators, more highly trained, more educated. In many cases, they'd been through POW training through SEER school. So they were better prepared for the experience than maybe your average 18 or 19-year-old. But they also had incredible leadership within the POW camp who taught them, you have a mission. Stockdale said, you may not be flying jets over North Vietnam on bombing missions, but you are still in this war. You were just fighting the propaganda battle.
So, Porter, let's talk about the Stockdale influence, because you seldom saw him, but he was leading you tactically and day to day. So talk to us about how that happened.
Well, I particularly remember Stockdale because he was one of the three top leaders that I had personal contact with early on in the experience. I was in the Heartbreak Hotel, which has 7 little cells, 4 on each side, and one was a washroom and so on. And so there were 7 occupied cells, and they were all occupied by people guys who had been shot down the day before or the day I was there. So that was 6 of us. And then I was looking out the crack in the window in the back, looking out at the courtyard, and a Jeep pulled up. And I saw this guy get out. He has a leg in a cast. He had his shoulder in a cast, crutches, and he hobbles in. And they put him into the empty cell that was right next to me. I was in cell 2. He was in 3, and then 4, and then so on. And this was Jim Stockdale. And we were all pretty junior officers and sort of glad to have a senior officer there. But he was in such bad shape that he was afraid he would not survive. He had been shot down about a month before those of us who were there, but we were the first Americans that he had seen. And so he, in some great detail, told us everything that had happened to him from the time he had been shot down and captured until his arrival here. He'd been all over the place. Anyway, he told us that because if he didn't survive, he wanted this story to go back to his family, to the Navy, and so on, to know what had really happened to him. So it was this kind of contact with Stockdale, and to learn who he was and all of that. And that leadership was so important because Stockdale, Denton, Rosner were leaders who led by example, by what they did and what they did not do, the advice that they passed along from their own experience. And this was especially important when it came to how to deal with torture and so on. And so the leadership at the top was so important. And had we had other leaders there who were not as courageous and not as smart as they were, our experience would have been different, because leadership really does make a lot of difference. But let me say that the Vietnamese understood this as well, and so they wanted to isolate our leaders, our top leaders, from the rest of us, because the whole idea was to try and isolate us, to prevent us from having the benefit of leadership or advice or orders, any news or anything. And so we lived in conditions that were very restrictive. You know, we couldn't make any noise. You couldn't, we had nothing to do except, as they say, you know, sit in your cell and think about your crimes. And so our top leadership was not directly in touch with the rest of us for most of the time. And their words would come out circuitously. And so leadership then fell to what we call the SRO, the senior ranking officer in the group that had communications that you could, you know, pass a note to, or you could tap on the walls and so on. And that leadership really became important on a day-to-day basis, because you go out for interrogation and they ask you to do something, you refuse, they do something to you, and you come back, and as quick as you can, you get on the wall, you tap exactly what happened. And so everybody else in that cell block, in that group, knows what to expect, because uncertainty is a terrible thing. If you don't know what's going to happen, it's uncertain. So.
And Stockdale, I read that Stockdale said that confession
Yes.
that you all did on a regular basis
Right.
had its own cathartic value. Not only was it
Right.
productive,
Right.
and it was spreading information around to other POWs, telling
Yes.
them, this is the information I gave up, let's synchronize our statements.
Exactly.
But it also had that cathartic value, just like confession does.
Well, yeah, because you'd feel like you'd let your shipmates, your country down, and they would sort of go, no, that's not what happened. I did the same thing. Here's, and you kind of let you off the hook.
I read that Stockdale said there are no virgins in here. We have all given up information that we wish we hadn't.
Well, I know, you know, the first time I was tortured, which was not right away. I mean, they didn't really institute a policy of torture until after the Hanoi March. We bombed Hanoi POL storage for the first time inside the city limits of Hanoi, and that was the last straw for them. And they said they were going to, you know, make a great demonstration. And so we were handcuffed 2 by 2, marched through the streets of Hanoi. It was the only time, aside from having that AK-47 against my temple, that I really feared for my life. I thought we were going to be slaughtered in the street by the crowd that had been worked up and all of that. Well, we weren't. And then that was right after that's when Fred and I were split up, and I went out to a really bad place and so on. And so that was a change in their policy. They had not been able to get what they wanted through any of these other methods, beatings and isolation and leg irons and kneeling down on the concrete floor for hours or whatever. And so they decided they were going to get what they wanted with extreme violence. And so we all went through this, and first time I went through it, I eventually got to the point where there was no will left to resist. And that's the nature of torture and the terror of it. And so in saying, I give, well, they said, you haven't suffered enough. So, and that went on for many hours more. And I realized that by definition, if you say I give, you have no more will to resist. You give up. But as a result, my hands were useless. I couldn't write what they wanted me to write, and so it was days later before. And during that time, I'm saying, how am I going to deal with this? I got to write something. I know if I don't, then I'll go right back into torture. And so I began to recover some will to resist. But from a personal point of view and a professional point of view, how can I give them something but screw it up? Now that became our way of dealing with it, I think, and later on, I think the official, what Stockdale and Denton and Reisner said, if you see they're going to torture you until they get what you give up a little early while you still have the will to resist, that you have the courage to institute a cover story, tell a lie, put in something that screws up the value of their propaganda effort. And so that was a lesson that was really important, because we were dealing with this all this time. And how do you deal with it? And fortunately, I will say one of the weapons that we had was the Vietnamese lack of understanding of American culture, American humor, sign language, and all of that. And so we could get away with a lot of stuff. And there were some really, really clever things that guys did. I remember one F-4 crew was tortured to do a bunch of things, and one of them was to provide the names of the people that were still in their squadron, still flying missions out there. And of course, they named Commander Dick Tracy and Joe Palooka, and right through the comic books and everything. Well, they didn't read the comics, so they didn't know. Right. So this was a great thing that we could use against them, was their ignorance of these kind of things. And so, tough lesson to learn, but we did.
Well, you mentioned let's call it the Hawaiian peace sign. Gesture that Paul Galante did that was on the cover of Life magazine. Right. They airbrushed the middle finger out.
Yeah.
And just like you're talking about Dick Tracy and that sort of thing, it worked until, ironically, perversely, some Western journalists would come to them and say, they're making fun of you.
Right.
Exactly. Right, and then you were punished for that because this, third party would basically call you out. But as we're talking about confession and the nature of letting yourself off the hook or others letting you off the hook, the other thing you discovered in plying that gray area of giving them information but not anything of any consequence, you realize that there's kind of this, let's just call it a game going on, where they didn't really even care about the facts. They just wanted you to give them something. Right. And that told you a lot about your captors.
Right, and I learned, the first time I wrote this first thing, which was, I think, they had a biography and an autobiography. I never could figure out what the difference was, but anyway, they wanted that. And I already knew what they already knew about me, and so there wasn't any point in lying about that. And all of a sudden, they one day, back up some, in interrogation, they bring my flight gear in, my flight vest. And we had carefully removed any patches or anything that identified our squadron, our ship, or anything. I didn't wear a wedding ring. I didn't carry anything except an ID card and dog tags. And so I wanted to be anonymous if I was, captured. So they bring in the flight gear, and they take the Mark 3C, which is a flotation device, off the vest. And cleverly, the ship's company had written VF-84 on the inside where you couldn't see it. Mm-hmm. I didn't know it was there. Nobody did. But that blew a lot of my cover as to who I was and so on. And somebody had also sent them information that only could have come from a newspaper article about my memorial service, because I was declared killed, and they had a memorial service and all of that. So they did know these things, and then I determined I would lie about everything else. So you write this, they come back and they say, this is no good, you have to write again. And so they're hoping that you will become more truthful. But in fact, they're not really reading it. They just want you to do it over and over under the threat of more torture, and so they think that you will become more truthful. Once you figured out that they really weren't reading it, they were just having you do it over, you become less truthful. You say, well, I can get away with more lies and so on. So that was one of the things we figured out.
The other thing that jumped out at me as we wonder, how do you pass the time? How do you go years in isolation and other challenging circumstances without going insane? As Taylor mentioned, you guys thrived. I remember Admiral Stockdale told me, actually at a Naval Institute event at the Tailhook convention in 1990, he was at the booth there, and Fred Rainbow had me take him around. And he mentioned to me that he was thankful for his time in captivity. That just struck me as a very strange sentiment, but it makes sense when you think about it. But one of the things that you mentioned that struck me as a guy who was living in an 8-man stateroom aboard the USS John F. Kennedy, we'd have these things that we did to pass the time. You guys had movie nights. So talk to us about what that was.
Well, most of my time up till 1967 or so was either in solitary confinement or with one other guy like Fred Cherry. I moved away from him and then eventually lived with a couple of other guys. And then all at once, we were moved into a different place. It was a bigger room, and there were already a couple of guys there. And as time went on, over the next hour or so, more guys came. And eventually there were 9 of us. Well, this was something entirely different than any experience we'd had before, because, you live with one other guy. Fred and I became incredibly close, swapped our lives and talked about everything and tried to teach each other what we knew and so on. But it's 24/7 with one guy, you do run out of time, stuff to talk about and so on. But here we were, we had these nine of us together, and we could, figure out who was senior and write down the line and arrange an organization. We had the CO, the XO, the ops boss, the morale officer, the education officer, and sometimes you wore several hats and so on. And one of them was the entertainment officer. And this was very important because he had to arrange for entertainment every night. And that's where the movies came in. And so he would approach you and say, okay, you're coming up here in a couple of days. It'll be your time to we said tell a movie, but okay. And so you had time to think of a movie that would be entertaining, and you had to stretch it out for at least an hour. So sometimes there were incredible guys there who could tell a movie exactly the way it happened. And I know going to these movies after I came home, I want to see how they, and some of them were just, I've seen this movie before. And some of them said, I don't know what the hell that is. You know, it was nothing like the real movie. But you had to be very creative. And so I lived with a guy named Fred Purrington, who was A4 POW. I think I lived with Fred longer than any other individual there, a total of 4 years off and on, and so on. So he had this one movie that he told, and so every time I would move in with a group and he would be there, he'd tell this movie again. It was called World in His Arms, and it was about this Greek fisherman, and I think Audrey Hepburn or somebody. Anyway, the only thing he had was this really rough outline. So I heard this movie about 4 times, and they were all different, but they were all really entertaining, you know. And so I think we perfected the art of constructing an hour-long movie. And of course, you had to kind of jazz it up and make it interesting. And of course, sex was, you know, one of the things that we did not have. And so that was, I thought somebody telling Picnic, R-rated version of Picnic would be kind of interesting.
You also mentioned that it was good when new guys were shot down because they'd come armed with new movies. And you mentioned Play Misty for Me, the Clint Eastwood movie. Right, you were like really excited that, you know, these guys, now you're going to have, it reminds me of back in the day when we had a finite number of roll-ums on the boat, and you'd run out, you know, you'd run out of the 8 movies that you had on. And so it's like the cod had come aboard and you'd have 3 new movies, and it was like really cool. Exactly. That reminded me of that.
See, it was exactly the same. You moved around and, you know, you heard new movies you hadn't heard before.
So sometimes you say the movie isn't as good as the book, but in your experience, the movie isn't as good as the way the movie was told to you in the Hanoi Hilton.
Exactly, yeah, that's right.
So I mentioned that the book contains some poetry. I wonder if you might read one of the poems to us.
Sure, I'll read one of the first, which this was early on, and I was just trying to express how I felt at the time, and it was when we were still optimistic that the war would be over pretty quickly. And during this time, I think the most pessimistic among us thought we would be there 2 years. The rest of us, you know, were anticipating much quicker than that. So anyway, excuse me, this first one that I wrote is called Winter Crypt. How can I describe the way that I feel? As if the stream I was crossing had suddenly frozen and locked my ankles in an icy grip, immobilizing that once fluid force, and I with it. And we have nothing to do but wait until the thaw. So, as time went on, we realized that we were going to be there longer than just a little bit, and there was a lot more to do than just sit around and wait for the thaw. And so this was, I kept thinking back on this poem, and then I realized that that really wasn't the description of what it was. We had to do a lot of stuff, and communicate was the main thing. That was the lifeblood of our organization, of our community, of our family. And so we risked a lot to communicate with each other, and that's what tied us all together. That's what you can have the greatest leaders in the world like Stockdale and Denton and Rosner, and at a different level, Bob Purcell and many, many others. Mike McGrath, for example. I mean, you all know Mike McGrath. It doesn't mean anything if you cannot communicate with those that you are leading. It's just a fact. And so we became professional communicators and went to great lengths to make sure that nobody was left outside of this network. And the examples that people provided of the incredible things that people did got passed around through this network. And I remember, if I could talk for a minute about Bob Purcell, that I knew so well and was privileged to live with him. He was an Air Force captain, probably been passed over because he flew his airplane inappropriately sometimes, and he had a lot of Article 15s. He probably also had a lot of letters of praise and so on. He was just that kind of guy, and he had leadership skills that nobody else had. You couldn't teach it. He just had a way. He could say no to the Vietnamese, and they just kind of accepted it, whereas if you'd say no, then it was received in a very different way. But I remember this story about Bob Purcell, we call him Percy, that he was in a cell. There was a hole in the ceiling, no way to get up there, and he heard that another POW down at the other end of this building was being starved. No food, no water. And what is anybody going to do about that? And he figured out something to do. He somehow got up in this hole, and I got in the book, there are pictures of that hole in the ceiling. And he got up there, he went down, and looking through the hole in the ceiling down into this cell, and there was another Air Force guy named Norland Daughtry there, who had 2 broken arms. One was broken in 2 places, the other at 3, one at the elbow. They had not treated him medically, had no sling, no casts, no nothing, which, was pretty amazing. And now they were using starvation against him. And so Percy felt he had to do something, and he got up there. First of all, he's looking down through this hole, and he sees poor Norland down there with his broken arms. And he said, "Hey, Norland." Well, Norland been praying a lot. He thought God was talking to him. Percy said, "No, it's me, Percy, up here." And, he told him a couple of jokes and everything to try and cheer him up. But what he did, he took all of his solid food, which was just rice and some little bits of stuff, and he made these little balls out of it, and he put it in his pocket, and he carried it down there, and he dropped this food down for Norland and others. He didn't do that just once. He did that every day for 2 weeks and risked his life, because getting out of your cell was an escape attempt, and they kill people for that. And so it was that kind of inspirational story. I mean, set the bar really high for, what you can do. And I realized at the time, and this occurred over time, that that first choice that I was forced to make, better place or worse place, determined the rest of my life, really. I wouldn't be here if I'd chosen the other way. And so the choice you make is so important. And they can take away every freedom that you enjoy as a human being. They could take away every one except for one, and that was the freedom to choose, God's great gift of free will. And so it was, Percy chose to do something. He was in an impossible situation. There's no way he could get up in that hole, and yet he did. He made a choice. And so I think we realized it was making a choice. What are you going to do no matter what happens was the key to survival and the key to preventing them from getting what they wanted. So that choice was wonderful. And you just heard about the choices that people made, and it was so inspirational. Never would happen if we hadn't had our communications network. And so that was why that was so important.
It's hard to overstate how unique the organization that they created in Captivity. all you have to do is read a book called King Rat, and there's a movie by the same name, to see the opposite. It was a World War II, it's based on a true story of a World War II POW camp in Japan, where it was every man for himself. And King Rat was one particular guy who hoarded food, took special treatment from his captors, and created division and strife among the POW community. That never happened in the Hanoi Hilton.
Right. Yeah.
That's leadership, right? That's the variable. So as Pete mentioned, we have mics here and here. If you have a question, let me take a question from one of the viewers. And part of this deals with something that you go into great detail towards the end of the book. In fact, you have your journal entries for the lead up to going home. And anybody who's deployed knows, you know, when the countdown calendar gets down to 10, it's hard to sleep, and all of the anticipation. Can't imagine what that would be like in terms of 7+ years in the crucible of North Vietnam. So talk to us about some of the feelings you had, some of the logistical situations. How did you get on the airplane? When did you guys realize? There's one scene where somebody saw a C-130 fly over, that kind of stuff. And then you saw clothes being stacked up.
Right.
And there's a funny vignette about you trying on 70s era clothing, right? Which, and it changed quite a bit. It's like the difference between the show Mad Men and, I guess, the movie Woodstock or something, right? So talk to us about the reintegration piece and some of the things that people might not have thought about.
To back up just a little bit, you know, when the bombing started again in late '72 with B-52s, and Nixon, you know, they had an agreement there, but they did not sign it. And anyway, when the bombing started, which I think Nixon realized that was what it was going to take, and they mined and all of that, about half of us moved up to a prison near China, out of harm's way. And I think they were afraid that if B-52s bombed the Hanoi Hilton and killed all of us, they would have nothing. They would have no bargaining chips at all. So we pretty much figured out that when we wouldn't go back to Hanoi until the agreements had been signed, the bombing had stopped and all of that, and that was true. And that's when I started making this little journal, because we knew this was the beginning of what possibly would be the end. And I had been disappointed so many times, you know, you grasp at straws. They had a medical exam one time. They had delegations come in, and every time you say, oh, they're getting us ready to go home, and your spirits would rise, and then you didn't go home, and they would fall. And so I wound up on this emotional sine wave, which was, I figured, not healthy. And now I couldn't do anything about going home. And so over time, I developed what I call long-term non-specific optimism, which just meant I'm not going to worry about stuff I have no control over. I'm going to concentrate on our lives. And by this time, I think we had come to think of ourselves as a family, a culture. And we had, amazingly enough, every aspect of culture, except for our real family. But we were a family. And so that was pretty incredible. And so I think I and most other people were not going to get super excited about going home until it actually happened. And so as I recorded in this little journal, we did come back to Hanoi, and they're handing out clothes and measuring you for shoes, and you know, it was pretty obvious that we're going home, and they were required to read the agreements, the Paris peace agreements, to us and give us copies. And so I cleverly used the backside of those pieces of paper to finish up my journal, which is at the Naval War College Museum. I've donated that. And so We were shuffled around in preparation. One of the big negotiations was the order in which we were going to call home. And our leaders, Stockdale and Denton Reisner and John Flynn, negotiated with the Vietnamese over this. And they wanted to send us home in the way they wanted. And we said, no, you're going to send the sick and the wounded and people that really, really need to get home quickly first. And then Alvarez and Shoemaker and so on, right on down the list. And in return, we promised that we would not make a demonstration and embarrass them at the turnover. And so, by and large, that's the way it worked. And so, it was not until I was on the second airplane. There were 3 airplanes on February the 12th. Sick and wounded, and the few very early ones in the first airplane, and then in my airplane, and Stockdale was aboard that airplane. Jerry Denton, spoke for the first group that came. And so we were mighty happy to be on that airplane, but said, something can happen and not happen.
Well, so you mentioned optimism.
The pilot said, we are feet wet, which meant we're out over the water, and we figured, okay, we're not going back. And that's when everything sort of exploded.
Well, there's that great footage of you guys cheering that's
Yeah.
in a documentary.
But we were pretty stoic before then. The Vietnamese, when they read these agreements, they thought we would be jumping up and down for joy and everything. We just said ho-hum and, went about our business.
Well, one of Taylor's tenets in the 6 sort of high-level points of your cohort, because you mentioned optimism, that's the choice you made. Another choice you made is forgiveness. And I know from being taught by some of your colleagues that one of the things that Stockdale put out was he says, don't kiss him on the way out, right? So that's the one thing, don't let him off the hook for the way you were treated, but you also chose to forgive, and you mentioned that wasn't necessarily for them, it's for you, and that was a posture that served you well with your reintegration.
Well, I didn't get any communication from home from Marty for 5 years, and of course she had spent a year and a half thinking I was dead, and I found out I was dead at about the same time she found out I was alive. So it's kind of an interesting situation. And you can imagine what went through my mind when Al Carpenter, who had been on our ship, but he had gone home. They'd had a med cruise and came back for another cruise, and he was shot down. And he was the one, he had been on our wing on that flight when we were shot down. And he said, it took 3 or 4 days to get calm back and forth between the buildings and everything. And he said, I'm delighted that you're here, but you're supposed to be dead. You're declared. And I said, okay. And so there was a great effort to get my name out by that time. And anyway, after 5 years, I did start getting a few letters and some packages that were largely pilfered, and the thing that was the most precious to me was a photograph of Marty and my daughter, who in this picture is probably about 4. The last time I had seen her, she was 5 days old, and so this was pretty powerful. The most precious thing that I had was this photograph, and I know at the very end, when they were, getting us ready, giving us these civilian clothes and everything, we were sitting around and talking about what we'll be doing in the first couple of days that we're home. And of course, this was what I was thinking about. And I overheard 2 guys talking about how they were going to get revenge, how they were going to get back at the Vietnamese for everything that they had done. And I said, you know, I said, we had hated them as a form of defense. If you hate someone enough, nothing they can do can convince you of the truth of what they're saying or the justness of their cause or anything. And so hatred had become an armor against the Vietnamese, and we were racist. We denigrated them. We looked down on them. We made up funny names for them and just ridiculed them in every way we could. And so this hatred was useful in that regard. And when I heard these guys say they were going to get revenge, then I realized that hatred had really taken hold, and it was powerful, and I was not going to take that home. I had already said, when I get out of here, these people are never going to adversely affect my life again. And I realized that if I took hatred home with me, then they would affect my life, because hatred is a poison. And so when I walked out of the gate, would get on the bus to go to the airport, I just turned around and said, I forgive you. And all that hatred, that armor fell away. And that was the most liberating thing I've ever done in my life. And so my life has been free from hatred ever since. And so that was the second really great lesson that I had learned. The first was about making choice. You always have a choice. And the second was the liberation that you feel in forgiveness. And of course, you have to make a choice to forgive. So those two great lessons sort of came together. You mentioned poetry. I'd like to read one more. And when I got this photograph and started thinking about life, life with Dabney and Marty, I wrote another poem. And this one is called The Three of Us. Yesterday, on meeting you, hoping without knowing you, knowing without asking you, loving without telling you. The young and misty two of us, sharing each the best of us, accepting too the worst of us, and we so good for both of us. And as for me, the faulty one, the wild and hungry, needy one, to spend my life in search of one and finding you the perfect one. And so we shared our pastel days, our soft and glowing magic days, and you with child within those days, and then our few but perfect days. Now two of you to wait for me, to love, to hope, to pray for me, and I still feel you part of me, though you and she so far from me. The future still so bright for us, for you, for me, for three of us. And she, the best of each of us, will fill the lives of both of us. And so she has. I will say that my daughter Dabney and her husband Walker Sanders just 2 days ago got Greensboro's highest award for civic service, for community development.
Really
Wow. That's from trauma comes art, and that is beautiful, Porter. You're a poet, and that's high praise. Another thing that Taylor points out here, and this is to the point of resilience and how this cohort has thrived in the wake of trauma and challenge, is the first ambassador when we normalized relations with Vietnam was a POW, Pete Peterson.
Yeah.
So let's speak to that a little bit.
It's ironic, right?
Or beautiful.
Yeah, absolutely, right. Absolutely. And I, John McCain, former POW, was an early advocate for normalizing relations when it was not a very popular stand to take.
So obviously, forgiveness was part of their
Absolutely.
makeup as well. So these are the books. I don't know where the camera is for the viewers at home. Must-reads, both of them. And thanks to the Naval Institute Press and the Naval Institute for pairing these two. And one RIO to another, I thank you for your lifetime of service and for writing it down. And Taylor, known you for long, I'm very proud of this book and how it's had such legs. Further, we'll say that you have a forthcoming effort coming out in May about the spouse effort on the home front.
Right here, Unwavering, the wives who fought to ensure no man is left behind, all about the epic home front battle that wives like yours undertook to rally a nation and a president around the plight. And you have a new book of poetry coming out.
I do. I finally decided to write down not just the poems that they appear in this book, the prison poems, but I've been writing poetry since the 11th grade. And so over time I had quite a bit. And during COVID, I have to say that was the impetus to finish this book. 50 stories that I had not finished, and so I completed them and so on. But I also found inspiration for poetry, more poetry, and again, to describe my relationship with nature, which is a lot of what I write about. And so I had witnessed a tree, a pine tree, being taken down in our backyard in Greensboro. And of course, the guy comes and the whole process of, and then it's gone and everything. And I watched this whole process. And so I wrote a poem I called Old Pine. And I wrote it in what I call tree verse. Which was graphically in the shape of a tree and so on. So anyway, that's the name of the book, is Old Pine.
When's it coming out?
And other poems from a long and fortunate life. And it'll be out, I think, in November of this year. Yeah.
Well, we'll look for that. So back to you, Pete.
Well, I think I could speak for others, even though I haven't had a chance to compare notes, that this was a very moving discussion and a conversation that'll stay with us for some time. And I think we should thank Porter Halyburton, Taylor Keeland, and Ward Carroll for a fantastic conversation. Let's give them a big hand.
Thank you.
I noticed that Admiral Sandy Winnefeld's here with us in the audience, and for the panel and our moderator, we've got his book, Sailing Upwind, our latest NIP offering, Leadership and Risk from Top Gun to the Situation Room. So I give you this. It's a small token of our appreciation. And again, we thank our audience, both in the room and virtual, for joining us here today. And again, a terrific conversation. One more hand of appreciation, please. And please join us out in the atrium if you want to participate in the book signing. Thank you very much.